How do you get the best out of your team in the toughest and most stressful of situations? Well, few people are more qualified to talk about this topic than our Road to Gold guest this morning. At the age of 26, Conrad Humphreys skippered his amateur crew to a dominant victory in the 2000-2001 edition of the BT Global Challenge, winning 4 of the 7 legs along the way. He's also competed in the solo Vendee Globe as well as the crewed Volvo Ocean Race, and he's also been on TV. So we're going to kick on him a little bit further into this, Conrad. So you talk about, I think it's the 6 senses of leadership.
Over the years, I've sort of built up, different sort of tools really. And in fact, when I applied for the Global Challenge, 130 skippers applied for that role. It was whittled down to just 12. And in the process of being whittled down to those 12, we were given a huge amount of leadership training. And one particular week, the final selection was a week-long program where we were given toolkits. How do you deal with morale? How do you win in turbulent times? How do you pick people up when they're already suffering? And actually, these toolkits are just really super useful. And so the 6 senses is a toolkit I've developed over the years, and it's a way of telling a story, but it's also just thinking about some particular sort of elements of building a team. So there are the 6 of them. I start with the sense of present. This is the moment where any of us could walk into, the shop floor, or let's say we'll walk into Emirates Team New Zealand, and within the first 5 minutes of being in there, you get a sense of where they are, what the culture's like, what the values like. If you walk in and I've done this with Motorola in the early days. They'd be in buildings behind closed doors. The leadership were all on, another tier of level of building, and you immediately felt it was us and them. And this is obviously going back, 20 years or so. But that sort of how is morale right now? And then from there, the next sense is the sense of excitement. As a leader, particularly on the Mutiny voyage, it's how do you get this group of people to be excited about the future? What are the opportunities that are there? How do you paint that picture of where we're going to feel? How are we going to feel when we're standing, at that finishing line holding the trophy? Because actually, it's that picture that will get you through all of the very, very difficult times, difficult moments. And then once you sort of, I guess, given your vision and you're sort of painted that picture of what success looks like, then the next sense is about the sense of belonging, being part of that group. And actually, that was the one thing that was really missing from the Mutiny series, because the way it was cast, there was no sense of belonging. There was a bunch of egos. There was a bunch of individuals who wanted to be sort of TV personalities. And actually, when we finished the production and crossed the finishing line, very quickly this group of people dispersed back into their normal lives. Ant Middleton went off and did his thing, and there was no sense of belonging. And actually, I found that really strange. We'd spent 60 days on board a tiny 7-meter boat. And literally this group, disappeared after it. No sense of belonging there at all.
Why do you think that was? That seems so strange, because for all the fact that I suppose if things got really bad, there was a feeling that Channel 4 would always come to the rescue. There wasn't that sort of impending sense of real doom behind the voyage, but surely a sense of shared suffering brings people together.
Yeah, in one word, I think it was down to leadership. I was in an interesting role, as in that voyage. So I was cast as the professional on board, but Ant Middleton was cast as Captain Bligh, and the only guy I've ever heard describe himself as an alpha male. he's a big character, and he wasn't really that interested in people, if I'm honest. He's a sort of a bit of a Marmite character. We got on very well during the voyage, tough as nails, and I thought, actually at times showed great courage, great leadership. But in terms of keeping the group together, didn't really bother him. This wasn't something that was important. And yet, 20 years on, we just celebrated our 20th anniversary of the Global Challenge, and those teammates and crewmates on that boat are still just as important in my life now as they were 20 years ago. And so, yeah, I thought it was strange.
Well, it's really surprising to hear that. And some of the people on this call may be familiar with the Who Dares Wins TV program that Ant Middleton headed up, which is basically this SAS boot camp training. I find it absolutely fascinating to watch these people be put through these horrendous processes and see who comes out at the end. But one of the messages that comes out of that from Ant Middleton and the other ex-SAS and SBS elite force troops is that you can't get through these stressful situations on your own. It's all about the teamwork that Hamish was talking about earlier. And yet Ant, from what you say, wasn't really living that out on this trip on the...
It's interesting. Ant's very smart when it comes to his pushing his own his own audience buttons and so on. But and there were elements on the voyage. In fact, there were a lot of elements in the voyage where I saw very, very good examples of leadership. But equally, I also saw some quite poor things. And one of the young lads who ended up leaving the voyage, Chris, the Scouser, who people remember sort of shouting at the telly, why have they got this, dodgy Scouser on the boat? And this was a mixed up, lost kid. He was cast, because of being a bit of a troublemaker, and he caused problems. And it was really interesting to watch that play out with Ant. Initially, I really took Chris under my wing and just tried to and he was a good little sailor, and I think he respected me. He didn't respect Ant because Ant didn't know how to sail, so he struggled with that. But then as the voyage went on, their relationship really deteriorated, and I liken it to probably being in the special forces. You don't suffer fools in that environment. You're working with the best of the best, the elite of the elite, and I think Ant struggled with having someone who was a civilian who just didn't care about him and didn't take any notice of him, and so eventually the relationship just became untenable. But yeah, there are attributes there that are good, and there are some quite poor attributes, and I think we've seen a mix of everything from watching Ant over the last few years.
Conrad, when you were training with the BT Global Challenge crew, the amateur crew, how much were you training for the worst case scenarios, things like man overboard, other scenarios that might crop up, but you hope they never do?
Well, to be honest, a lot of the sort of skippers that do get selected, I think for Clipper and for Global Challenge, were the training skippers, and they practice this stuff day in, day out. The beauty of my role was I could come in and just tear up the rule book and actually teach them how to sail properly, and to really focus on those things that actually they just weren't taught. This is a 72-foot, 40-ton steel boat. They used to walk around the boat like a herd of elephants. I remember one day, they were stomping around the boat in very, very light winds, with their big clumsy boots on and tripping over everything. And I just made them take their boots off and their shoes and socks, and everything off. And I said, we're going to spend the day bare feet on the boat. And this was an absolute no-no in challenge. I mean, if Che ever saw you, sailing with bare feet, he would, probably fire you on the spot. It was so of course, they were all getting, upset with me about it. by the end of the session, end of the day, there was sort of bits of toenail and blood and all sorts of stuff all over the deck where they stubbed their toes and banged their feet. But when they put their boots back on, they were like angels around the boat. You know, they mentally connected with all the trip hazards, all the problems that were there, and they were swift and they moved around the boat really, really well. During the corporate days, you know, people would say, "Oh, what can you do on a corporate session with corporate guests?" But we used to bring on boxes and boxes of ice for the drinks. So I used to have 4 crew members, and I would just repeatedly make them do sail changes I'd get them to put their hands in the ice for a minute, so their hands wouldn't work, and then they'd have to hank on these sails. Because in the Southern Ocean, they wouldn't be able to hank on these sails with their gloves on, and actually you've got to go through that kind of sort of almost numb feeling of being able to do things with. So I spent a huge amount of time actually trying to untrain a lot of bad habits and put in some very different habits, which ultimately really paid dividends in our performance. I mean, we had this phrase that the first 72 hours was critical to our race. And if you look back at that race, 9 times out of 10, within the first 72 hours, we were somewhere near the front. And we would establish the pecking order from that day in. And I didn't have an out and out team of winners. In fact, our sort of values were focused around fulfillment as number one. Winning was a sort of a distant second. It was important to me. I wanted to win. I wanted to use it as a stepping stone, like Pete Goss and Mike Golding had to the Vendee. But making winning a habit became a bit of a mantra, because actually once you've got a taste of winning, doesn't matter if you're not particularly competitive, once you've got a taste of that feeling of winning as a team, it's infectious. And once we had a little bit of a taste of it, we wanted it more and more and more, to the point where the penultimate leg coming into La Rochelle, we had a bad leg. Will Oxley on Compag clawed some 8 points back on us. We were still 5 points ahead going into the final leg, so we'd have to really stuff things up to lose it. But all of a sudden we were under this sort of massive pressure. But the pressure was more internally, because actually coming second in that race would have felt like total unfulfillment, having dominated the race from start to finish. So I was having to manage crew members who were kind of really scared about coming second, given that we had been so successful. So making that sort of habit forming of winning was quite important to us.